1 Minute Mommy presents A Moment to Parent. And today's topic is the truth about tantrums. Hi everybody, and welcome to A Moment to Parent with 1 Minute Mommy. My name is Paige Michaelis. I'm the founder of 1 Minute Mommy. And 1 Minute Mommy provides parenting resources and education to the Tampa Bay area and beyond. This is our first webinar, and we're really excited about it today. And we'd love to get your feedback or comments. And today we're going to be talking about tantrums. I know a lot of you out there have already experienced many tantrums over the course of your children's lives. And we're going to give you some great advice about what a tantrum is, how to stop them before they start, and also how to handle them once they do occur, which is sometimes inevitable. Today I'm here with Maureen Greiner. She's a very good friend of mine and my colleague, and I'll let Maureen talk a little bit more about herself and about her background and experience.
Thanks, Paige. Well, my name is Maureen Greiner, and I'm really happy to be here with 1 Minute Mommy today and my good friend Paige. And my experience is, I can give you all the academic stuff, like I have my master's degree in counseling, and I've been in the field for almost 18 years. And 17 of those years were working with military families in Colorado, which I loved and was such a great honor. I recently moved here to the Tampa area, and so now I'm happy to be working with 1 Minute Mommy and trying to help families in this area as well. So that's all the academic background kind of stuff. But the truth of the matter, the part that gives me kind of more credibility than anything else, is that I am the mom of 4 boys, ranging in age from 23 to 10. So I too have experienced my share of temper tantrums. Witnessed my kids having them, and witnessed myself having them. So, so I have lots of experience in the area.
4 boys. That'll keep you very busy.
Very busy. But I feel very blessed.
Yes.
Very blessed.
Definitely. Well, first we want to get started and just talk a little bit about what a tantrum is and how it relates to this class. So if you could give us a little bit of a definition about what a tantrum is related to this class.
Well, it's interesting. That's a great place to start. I think a lot of people, when they think about tantrums, they think about young children, right? You think about your 2-year-old having a tantrum or your 5-year-old having a tantrum. And that's true. Young children have more tantrums than anybody else. I mean, that's most of the times what we're thinking about. But the truth of the matter, if you really think about it, even adults have tantrums. We all have tantrums. I'm sure that if we really stop and examine our own behavior, even in the last week, we would find that we've had tantrums too. Hopefully we're not laying on the floor and kicking and screaming and all those kinds of things at our age. But it's true that tantrums can affect all different ages. Now, for the sake of today's class, because it seems to be the best example, we're going to talk about young kids. But when you really understand why a human being at any age is having a tantrum, it kind of gives you some better tools on how to deal with it.
So it's not just for small children. I know that last night I had a mini tantrum myself. So I understand what you're saying, and I'm sure a lot of people out there do as well.
I know. If anybody here doesn't, I would just say just drive on the road for a little bit. You'll see either yourself or somebody else having little mini cases of road rage. That would be, in some ways like a tantrum, when our emotions are getting the better.
Absolutely. Are there certain ages when a tantrum is more prevalent than another age? I know when my girls were 2 and 3, they had a complete meltdown in the middle of the library. Right. And that was pretty tough and pretty devastating to me. But
yeah,
for a typical age.
It's interesting. They say that the ages of rebellion for kids, are 2, 5, and 11. So those are certainly times that you might see them kind of pushing more around certain things. But I think what's key in what you said is when you talk about your girls having a temper tantrum in the library, even without giving us any other detail, everybody watching this webinar can picture what that was like. And we can picture it because we've been there, right? We know what this is like. We all have an idea about what a temper tantrum looks like, right? We all have an idea about what it looks like. I think where it gets kind of tricky is there's a lot of, I want to kind of say bad information out there about what it is. There's some bad information out there, what is actually going on when your beautiful daughters are falling apart in the library, right? Or,
right.
what's really going on for me when I'm in traffic and, all of a sudden, I'm not the kind of person that yells, but I'm yelling at the person in front of me like they can hear me. Like, what's going on? So it's kind of like really, we know what they look like, but what are they really? There's a lot of bad information out there.
And tell me more about the bad information. What does that mean?
To me, the worst information that's out there right now about tantrums that really can impact your ability to really kind of handle them in a productive way is there is just a common theme that all tantrums are about manipulation. That really like if you take like the typical most basic scenario ever, you think about a 2-year-old in the grocery store who's wants candy, right? Of course, you get to the checkout line, finally get up there, and of course that's when it all happens, right? They want the M&Ms or whatever it is, and you say, no, I'm sorry, you can't have the M&Ms, and then what happens, right? We all know, right? They're laying on the floor, they're crying, they're screaming, whatever. Everyone's looking at you, right? It's like the thought is, what we kind of put out there is that 2-year-old is doing that just to get the candy, that somehow the 2-year-old in their brain is thinking, if I could just scream loud enough, cry loud enough, be angry enough, mom or dad is going to reach over there and pick up those M&Ms and put them in the lunch. And that's kind of what a lot of people think is going on.
Okay. I understand.
What I challenge you guys to think of is that when it's a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or especially a little boy or a little girl, is that that's probably not what's going on. It's probably not what's going on at all. Now, if it was your 12-year-old doing that, I would say maybe that's what's going on, right?
Right.
But what we know is that for little people and for big people alike, that sometimes when we're really, really disappointed or we feel really, really hurt or scared, that our body really does dump these interesting combination of chemicals into our bodies that totally makes us kind of melt down or become flooded. It's a word that we use a lot. And it's to the point to where you're so overwhelmed by those feelings that it's really hard to make a good, rational decision. And that's when we're talking about grown-ups, right? Like when you've had, something after something after something after something pile on, you can become flooded with those emotions where it's really hard to tap into that part of your brain that's the really rational part of your brain.
Right.
For little kids, what you have to think about is that for a 2 or 3-year-old, that rational part of the brain, which is the very top part of the brain, I'll use my hand kind of as a demonstration, is the very last part to develop. And at 2 or 3, it's really just starting to make any kind of significant connections.
I see. So that part of the brain is the part that allows them to make a conscious choice or a conscious decision about doing something.
It's the part of the brain that allows you to go, oh, if I do A, then B may happen. Okay. And that part there, I'm not going to say it's not developed at all, but it's really not developed in any capacity that they can, when they're overwhelmed with so many intense emotions, shut those emotions down.
Well, I understand that part of the brain doesn't fully develop until you're, around 25?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the research out there shows that, especially for males, that it tends to be into their 20s before that part is completely developed, which, it explains a lot of how you'll get a child who they're young and maybe they have some tantrums and some hard time dealing with their emotions when they're younger. Then through kind of elementary school, they maybe start to get a grip on it, but then when the stakes get higher in adolescence and those emotions get even more intense and the stakes are higher, they start to have a hard time again. And it takes them a while to figure out how to manage all that stuff.
Sure, absolutely.
So that is one of the main, misconceptions, is that when people think about tantrums, they think about it as just manipulation. And what I would say is that it's not always just manipulation, especially with our little guys.
So then I know some of our watchers or people watching today are saying, well, but I know that my child is being manipulative.
Right.
Because sometimes it can be that, right?
Absolutely. Here's the trick is that if this is, something important to think about. So I'm saying that 2 or 3-year-old that's having the temper tantrum for the candy, maybe it doesn't have as much control over having that temper tantrum as you think they do. right? So they're flooded with emotions, overwhelmed. They don't have anything to do with it. So they can call up a friend and talk about it, right? Or take a deep breath, or count to 10, or rationalize it. So it just
have the language to be able to express anything, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially when they're emotional. Think about how hard it is for you to come up with a language as an adult when you're overwhelmed with emotion. And they don't even have a good connection. So, anyways, the whole point is that even though you think that, it feels like manipulation, the first thing I want you to think of is it really manipulation? Do they really have the ability to make a better choice at this moment? Okay, that's the first thing. But the second thing is that if in that moment, because you've listened to this webinar, you feel so bad for your 2-year-old, you're like, oh, they can't help it. So you reach up there and you grab the M&Ms and you give them. Then you might have a child that learns how to manipulate. So the key to being a really caring and thoughtful parent in this situation is not to give in. Because think about what happens when you give in. You don't just don't have a plan how to deal with this time.
Right. They'll learn that when you give in, that they'll get more and more and more, and so it's kind of like a balance, then, right?
It is like a balance. It is like a balance. Where ultimately in life you're going to have to live with it. And there's going to be things that you want that you can't get. You have to have some skills to deal with it. And I guess what we're saying here today is that your 2-year-old, your 3-year-old maybe doesn't have those skills yet. That doesn't mean you give in all the time, because then you're going to have a 20-year-old that still doesn't have the skills. It's like sometime between 2 and 20, you've got to help them learn this. That's part of the cornerstone of being a mentally healthy adult, is that you have the ability to do something we call self-regulate, which means that when you have really tough feelings, when you have really challenging times, that you have some ways, whether it's through your own self-talk or whether it's seeking outside resources for yourself, like calling up a friend or going for a run or something, that you have ways to manage those tough feelings.
Right.
So, because it doesn't look good when you're our age, you go out there and scream and cry, and it doesn't work, right?
That's true, but let's talk a little bit about how, let's say that the parent is not necessarily doing some of those things, and how does that affect the child? So sometimes we're also busy and we are working full time, or even just taking care of our home full time, and our husbands are working full time, and we have so many things going on that the level of self-care or the level of really self-regulating, like you were saying, is pretty impossible. Right. So how does that affect our child and tantruming?
It's such a good point, Paige, because I always think of it as like a cup, and like we all have our limits, and we've all, if you're a mentally healthy person, then you probably have a pretty good sized cup. And what I mean by a cup is that if you're dumping frustrations into that cup, like you can get a lot in before that cup is overflowing, right? So a little kid, like a 2 or 3 year old, their cup is so little, they can't take very much, right? So the time they get through at the grocery store and they've had the bright lights and 10 different strangers come up and comment at how cute they are, and then they can't have their favorite cereal and they can't have the favorite macaroni and cheese, that by the time they get to that checkout line, that cup is up to the top. It's such a small cup. Right? Now, but for us as adults, hopefully we've had someone help us learn between 2 and 20 how to grow that cup and make that cup bigger, and manage that, so that that if I've been doing this for 18 years, and I went to college for 6 years to learn all about emotions, and sometimes my cup overflows, and it's not pretty when it overflows. And so what I have to know as an adult is, how do I dump some of that cup out and not just keep letting it get fuller and fuller and fuller until it overflows? Right. Because when it overflows is when I'm not acting right. And the truth of the matter is like, if you think about, if I remember back to the time when my kids were little, that cup got full. Really exhausting, really fast. And you know what would really fill up my cup really fast? If we just made it through the grocery store, and then at the end we have the big meltdown, right? That cup can fill up really, really fast. So yes, I am saying when your cup is fixing to overflow, you have to be a good model on how not to act out that overflow. How are you going to do that? And so part of it is learning what are the things I need to do to keep my cup from getting too full too fast.
Right.
And so sometimes it means that, you have to find a way to carve out time for yourself. Like, I am not going to be able to teach my child how to regulate their emotions and how to manage their behavior if I'm a martyr and I just am a parent 24/7. A very wise teacher once said that parenting is not a sentence. Like, it shouldn't be 24/7 nonstop. And I know this is hard. I mean, I work with military families who sometimes the spouse was deployed and you had one person caring for everything while the spouse was deployed. It's really hard for little kids, but you're a better parent, which means that if you have to drop them off at daycare or you have to have a really nice, wonderful babysitter come over, even if they really don't like it, you're really doing that for them. You feel like you're doing it for yourself, but truthfully, you're doing it for them. It makes you a better parent if your cup is not overflowing.
Right, absolutely. I think in this day and age, it's really, really hard. Like I said at the beginning, it's just hard to, I think as moms, we sometimes put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be super moms sometimes.
To be perfect, to have it all right for our kids to walk through the grocery store and hold the cart and never run away. And
we're looking gorgeous.
And it's so interesting because on top of all that, we don't have the systems that we used to have. Where we used to not be as tough on ourselves, but we also used to have family members, that lived near us, dear friends that we grew up with that we could kind of rely on. And that's really the way, ideally that we parent is that we have a lot of helpers. Yeah, we're the main show.
The village.
But we have some good helpers to help us. So I think if you're trying to be a parent on your own and do it all on yourself and never give yourself a break and have really high expectations, you're probably going to overflow a lot. And you're going to feel like you're trying to do everything for your kids. But in the end, to really think, is that really helpful to them? Or is it better to, we know the number one way that all mammals learn is by modeling. So modeling, how do you take care of yourself? And then when you're in a tough situation, what do you do with it?
Right.
When you mess it up, do you go back and apologize? When you're feeling it coming on, you can say, okay, you know what, Mommy's really feeling overwhelmed and stressed right now. I'm going to go take a break.
Right, putting yourself in TimeOut.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
That's a good one too, for sure. So I guess some of the things we've talked about so far is to kind of understand that developmentally our little kids really can't always help those tantrums. It may feel like manipulation, but a lot of times it's just they have nothing else to do with this tough feeling.
Right.
And so it's just going to come out. It's not pretty, but it's part of not having that brain quite developed yet. And the second thing I think that we talked about, just to make sure we're covering our points here, is that any of us, we all have our moments, right? So that even as adults, we have times when we are not managing well. And so part of to remember for ourselves and for our kids too is that we're taking the time to kind of empty some of that stress out of the cup. And it truly is a physiological phenomenon that we can talk about in research, and they've done in research. So when we're chronically stressed, we chronically dump these chemicals that shut down the rational part of the brain.
Well, and isn't it also true that our children pick up on those chemicals from us? Is that called mirror neurons or something?
It is. It's mirror neurons, and it was something that evolved back when we all lived out on the savannah, they would say, or back in more primitive times when, if you think about it, our children needed to be able to read our cues really, really well, as did the other people in our village. Because if we were all in a village and I sense danger, Paige want to be able to pick up on that really quick, because we all need to try and be safe. And so if when our children are having a temper tantrum or having a hard time, our emotions are going out of control and we can't manage ourselves, then that only makes your temper tantrums worse, because now on top of all those other chemicals that they've dumped and all of the other feelings that they have this feeling of insecurity and fear, because the person that's supposed to protect them and care for them is now having all these tough feelings too. And they don't have the ability to rationally go, oh, Mom's just, annoyed because everyone in the grocery store is looking at her. In their little bodies, it's just fear. That's all they have is fear. Something's wrong.
Right. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the brain development, like you said. and some ways on how to prevent tantrums from starting. Are there other ways that we can kind of nip it in the bud before it gets started?
Sure. I think the best practice when you're talking about temper tantrums is do everything you can to prevent them. And by this, I do not mean coddle your child or protect them from any frustration that could ever possibly happen. But don't add fuel to the fire, I guess would be like a cliche to say. So, for example, we'll keep going back to the grocery store because it's the most vivid. We all can think about the grocery store idea, right? Okay, so it's kind of old news now, right? But we don't take our kids to the grocery store when they're hungry, when they're tired, when you're hungry, when you're tired.
Well, you only have 5 minutes to shop when you're
right. And I know it's hard. Sometimes it might mean that maybe you shop when you have someone else to watch the kids, whether that's your spouse or a babysitter. Like sometimes those were the best dollars I spent on babysitters. No, it didn't feel like it was a totally rejuvenating experience, but the fact that I could go to the grocery store and not be adding to my cup, my stress cup, that was sometimes the best way I could use that allotment of time.
And sorry to interrupt you, but another really great tool that we talked about on my website and on my Facebook page is a kid swap. So have set up with a group of friends to your created village to be able to have them take your child or children for even if it's 1 hour or 2 hours, just to give yourself that alone time, and then you swap with them and take their kids for 1 or 2 hours.
And that's like the best of everything, because then you're also getting one of the ways to dump someone in cup is that you make connections with other people, which we know is probably the best way to manage your stress, is that you have some good connections. Like I always tell everybody, thank goodness that I had good friends I could call up and say, quietly so the kids couldn't hear me, but I'm saying, oh my God, he's driving me crazy, like I'm going to pull all my hair out or something like that, because it saved me, but it also saved me, like a place to kind of dissipate that. And so I would say things like that, think about those in terms of your kids too, right? Like if you're gonna ask them to do something where they're gonna have to sit still and be quiet, they can't do that all the time. So you have to make sure that there's times that they get out to play and that they get to do other stimulating. When you go to the grocery store, it's hard. Try and pay attention to them. Pay attention to them in the good stuff. Don't wait for them to have the fit and pay attention. But then they'll learn to manipulate for the attention.
Right. And keeping them busy at the store, allow them to have some choices around, okay, what kind of cereal do you want to have today, X or Y?
Right. Yeah, you keep it very limited, because too many choices is, just the whole grocery store experience can be overwhelming for kids. But to break it down ahead of time, talk about what you expect, which even with a 2-year-old it's possible. I don't know how much they remember. But make sure your trip is reasonable. And you can apply that to so many different things besides the grocery store. You can think about cleaning the room, right? Like, okay, so they have to clean the room, or you want them to help to learn to clean the room. Well, if they've taken every toy, out and dumped it all in the middle of the room, you can't just say, go clean the room and then tell them to do it. Let's pick one little thing, right? Like, let's pick up.
I wish they would do it.
I know,
but
right?
They won't.
Let's pick up all the Barbies, or let's pick up all the dirty clothes, or whatever it's going to be first. And that might be as much as they can do at that point, right? So it's just really giving some reasonable expectations. When you're rested, this is development appropriate, when you're fed, all those kinds of things. So,
I've heard that songs go a long way too, in terms of the cleanup or even
the grocery store.
Right, and providing safety too. Believe it or not, singing songs or singing the same song kind of around different parts of the day also gives the child a sense of safety as well.
Which just brings up another really good point about temper tantrums is routine. And that, that would be one thing when I'm working with new parents that I would just say, not a rigid, tight schedule, but a routine. Because, I always think about bedtime. Think about how many meltdowns we have around bedtime. And, my example is always that if bedtime is between 8 and 8:30 every night, no matter how much you tantrum, no matter how much you cry, that between 8 and 8:30 every night, that's when we go to bed, and we have a routine. We have a bath, we read a book, tuck you in, I give you a kiss, go to bed. Eventually, children will learn, this is bedtime. Well, if you're all over the place with bedtime, if sometimes it's at 7 and sometimes it's at 8, and then some nights you're looking to stay up till 10, and then the next night it's 9, and then it's 8 again, I can promise you that most children are going to tantrum every night at bedtime because they're always going to be in their minds. It's going to be like, ooh, maybe this is the night, you know. And we're talking about older kids. We're not talking about 1-year-olds or 2-year-olds. We're talking about 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. They will struggle to get that later bedtime.
Right. So it goes back to that giving in scenario, right?
It does.
That one time, then they know that they can.
It does. I always say the joke when I teach my classes. I always say, if somebody came to my class and begged me to give them $100, and I said, no, I'm not giving you $100, and they lay on the floor and cried, and I gave them $100, what would they do the next time they come in the class? Right? And the trick is, I know, right? I mean, I would lay on the floor and have them sit if people give me $100 every time, right? But the problem is that then if you've gotten into that pattern where you're giving in, maybe they have become manipulative, when you decide you're going to stop, and at first the tantrums are going to get worse. You're going to get a lot worse, but you got to be strong. This is when you really need those friends that you can call, and you really got to make sure that you're keeping your cup really low, because that tantrum will be really, really long this first time. You'll be like, oh, I want my $100, right?
Well, and that's a really good point, because oftentimes I get people coming to the classes, and sometimes the feedback is, well, but it's not working right away, and it's because it's change, and change takes time, and initially there might be some increased pushback. Because the child's like, wait a second, what's going on here?
If they've learned,
and that's when the parent has to be really consistent. Right?
It's true. It can take a really long time. And what I would say is that this is where that whole thing with kids and temperament comes up. That sometimes, for some kids, you know, you'll watch this webinar and be like, hey, I'm not going to give in, and we're going to talk about what to do in a minute. But you don't give in. And some kids, they'll get it right away. And they'll be like, wow. And you can make the mistake I did with my first son. My first son was really easy like that, and I thought, I'm a really good parent. I got this down, right? And then my second son came along and blew that theory in the water, that it was not about me. It was about I had a really easy temperament for my first one and a more challenging temperament than my second son. And, you know, he was the kind of kid that when I would say, no, I'm getting serious about it, we might have battles for days, you know? And I just had to really be strong. I'm happy to say for good. I'm a very happy 20-year-old now. Just a 20-year-old doesn't do that anymore. But it's harder. It's without a doubt. Some kids it's harder than others.
Right.
You got to stay strong.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's just talk a little bit about when a tantrum occurs, which is going to happen, right?
Right.
What can we do about it? So if our child's in the middle of the grocery store and we get to that point where they're on the floor screaming and kicking, and what do you do, right? Besides run out of the store?
And I wish there was like a magic wand or like a set of steps they give you. Always do this, and it's always going to work out for the best. And you know, parenting is an art and a science. And I think the first thing I would always say, which might be the hardest part of the whole thing to do, is to get yourself in check, right? And that might mean that, like, before you're even in that situation, you're thinking about how are you going to handle it, which you are right now. You're on this webinar, right? But two, to think about really get in touch with what's the most important thing to you. I know that a lot of times, you know, the things that parents will tell me is it's awful. Their child's laying in the middle of the floor, and, of course, everybody walking by is staring at them and giving them dirty looks. And what I really want to encourage you to think about is, at the end of the day, that person who walks by you and gives you the ugly look, you don't really care what they think about you. It's hard. It's really hard. It's really, you have to get yourself in the right place, because just like you talked about earlier, if your emotions are pumped up and crazy, the kid's going to pick up on that. It's just going to be worse. So you have to remember that at the end of the day, by the end of the day, I mean like 20 years from now, that person who walked by in the store, you don't even know who they are. So who cares what they think about you? What you care is about that little person on the floor. And you care about what they think of you and about the kind of person that you are. And just even going into a situation like that, or approaching parenting like that right there is going to take away some of that stress that you feel initially, right?
That's a really good point. I mean, the saying that I like the most is to really be parenting with the end in mind. So,
Right.
How are we, what are we doing today that's going to make them the people that we want them to be in the future?
Right. Like, what is the goal? And I know that in that moment, sometimes it's
right.
really hard.
In the middle of the library.
It's really hard.
It's very hard.
But I did find for myself that when I got myself at peace with that, like, I'm not going to make everybody happy. I certainly don't want my kids to be a burden on anybody else, but at the same time, they're kids. And they have to learn something, and that in public places, there's no other way to replicate that. Like we can learn some of this stuff at home, but some of it has to be out in the world.
Right, right.
So that's the first thing, is to get yourself in a good place. Because I will say it again, the number one way that all mammals learn is by modeling. So the very most important thing that we have to do is model for our kids what we want them to do. We have to think about the way I'm presenting myself right now in this situation is really what's going to influence that whole brain. So if I lose it, what I'm teaching him is that when you're stressed out and overwhelmed, lose it. That's what I'm teaching him. And that's not what I want to teach him, right? Or her, right? I want to teach them what to do instead. So, little guys falling out, having a temper tantrum, deep breath for myself, and then what I probably want to do is, if I can, and I know not with all kids this is always not a great idea, but for some kids, a little touch, like a little touch on the shoulder, it's enough that you're connected to them, so they're back into kind of the real experience, like, okay, they're not just floating out there overwhelmed with emotions. Touch is very common. And in a really calm voice, I'm going to try and validate what's going on for them. So if we go back to the candy example, it might be, getting down low, just giving them a light touch on the shoulder or something and saying, you know what, I know that you're really, really sad right now that you can't have the candy. Or you keep it to something like, I know you're really, really mad right now and you really, really want that candy and I wish we could always have candy whenever we want. We can't get candy today. You can give a little bit of explanation, like you can say something like, we can't get candy today because we need to go home and have lunch. Or we can't get candy because we don't get candy every time we go to the store. I know that's really hard and you're really disappointed. And then you stop. Then you don't say anything else. If they go, but I want candy, you said I could have candy. You don't say, I didn't say you could have candy. Why did I say you could have candy? Then you're in an argument like a little kid. Right? And I can promise you, your cup's going to get really full, really fast and overflow. You've said what you needed to say. You've validated what they're feeling and what's going on for them. For a lot of kids, just that validating, they'll look at me and go, yeah, I am sad, or something like that. And that's great. And you can say, yeah. And you can say, there might be someday that will can't get started, but not today. Maybe that'll bring it back. And for other kids, they're going to keep going. Don't engage with that. Because what can happen is that it can start out to be about, I want the candy. But what that kid might learn, if you're really, really engaged, if you take it past that just kind of basic being a good human and validating another person in need, is that they might learn that, oh, I get this other thing that happens. That stuff we were talking about before, that attention, that, I've got mom's attention now, so that it may seem like they're temper tantruming for the candy, but really it's something else. So it's kind of this really delicate balance where you acknowledge, validate, empathize, just enough. Right?
And then stop.
Right? Because the truth of the matter is that when anybody, be it child, be it grown person, is that cup is just overflowing and bubbling over, their brain is not in a place where it can really learn.
Right. And that brings up another question. So once the child is calmed down, do we then try to teach them more about what's happening, how that's not okay,
Absolutely.
Or do we just let it go?
I definitely think you go back and you talk about it. Now, I want to be careful because I don't want you to take that as you go back and you consequence. Okay. At a certain point, if the child is older and it is manipulation, you can do some consequences. But little kids, they can't go, like, I just think about when you're in the middle of melting down and someone says, if you do this, then this is going to happen. You can't, your rational part of your brain is not thinking. So you're not making.
It's just going, woo,
exactly.
Right
so
over
you're
there.
not making the best choice. Like, I can remember when my little guy, Colin, and he loved his, like, we had, like, Sega Genesis way back then, and he loved his little, like, 45 minutes he got on it and he played this Barney game or something else. And I remember that he would struggle. And I would say to him, Colin, if you choose to, melt down or have a fit or whatever it was, or you choose to act like this right now, then you're choosing not to get to have your 45 minutes on the Sega tonight. It's a Sega Genesis. But he never stopped him, and he loved that more than anything in the world. And it took me a few times to understand that. At that moment, he wasn't thinking about that.
He's not making the connections
not
at all.
Not at all.
Right.
So I could have said, you're never going to get to play video games for the rest of your life, and I'm going to lock you in a dungeon and anything. And he would have kept going on because he's not hearing any of that.
And how old was he then?
We're talking about even like 3 or 4.
3 or 4.
Yeah, and even when you get to 5 or 6 and older, for certain kids, those chemicals, like I said, some kids it's more than others, are so intense.
Right.
That being on the backside of it, like what I mean by the backside is the tantrums happening, and then you're trying to get all that water back into the cup. It just doesn't always work very well. You're so much better on the proactive side, because on the proactive side, I could teach them things like, when you're starting to feel like that, here are some things that you can do to make it better.
Teaching him about those things.
Yeah.
Right.
Like when he was little, I had to do them for him, like transition times. Like if I were to walk into a room with Dustin and say, okay, Dustin, put down your Legos, it's time to go eat dinner. And Dustin's my older son. Dustin would be like, okay, right? And then Colin, if I were to walk in there and say, Colin, put down your Legos, it's time to go eat dinner. I don't want to eat dinner, I'm not done playing. Which is perfectly normal. It wasn't that Dustin was good and Colin was bad. They were just 2 different kids. It was Tempermenu. And so for me, it was like, as a parent, learning to do something like, okay, Colin, you have 10 more minutes till dinner. Okay, Colin, you have 5 more minutes till dinner. Okay, Colin, we have 2 more minutes, 1 more minute. It's not like then you always, jumped up and went to dinner, no problem. But it certainly lessens a lot. But think about that now as an adult. That's something that he has to do for himself. He has to learn to do for himself. But you know what? I don't do good with just switching right away. Like, I have to have a plan. Like, I just think about our alarm clock even, right? Like, how many of us hit the snooze button every morning, right? It's like we don't set our, we think we're going to get up at 6, but we know we're always going to hit the snooze button and get up at 6:10. So why don't we just set the alarm clock for 6:10? Because we like that running. Some of us really like that, like a transition. Like, okay, I wake up enough to hit the button, knowing that I'm going to have to get up soon. And some people need to learn how to do that for themselves.
Well, and that's another great tool to use even in the grocery store scenario. So we're going to be in the store for 5 minutes, and we're going to be getting X, Y, and Z, and you can help me pick out those items, and then we're going to go. And that's it.
Exactly.
So when they have that awareness, that understanding as to what's happening, and
that they can start doing it for themselves. I mean, that's the goal, right? Like, I'm not following Colin to college going, okay, you have 10 more minutes, right? He has to learn to do that for himself. But back to the scenario in the store. So you validate them, and then you let it go. And sometimes what that means is it does mean you have to pick them up and carry them to the store, right? Which is never any fun.
Leave the cart of groceries there.
Leave the cart of groceries there, yep. Sometimes it just means, I can't count the number of times that I, went to pay and had a screaming, crying toddler on my hip, pulling my hair or whatever, having a fit in my arms because, doggone it, I'm going to get this milk before I leave, And it, who cares, who sees me? And remember, I was, teaching parenting classes on a military base, so I'm sure plenty of the parents that I taught got to see me in some challenging situations with my kids. The truth of the matter is that if you've been there, you feel for that parent, you don't judge that parent. And that the best thing to do is to validate, love them, don't give in, and don't overdo it with the attention. Because overdo the attention and love them, they're not happy. Right? Then you can never do enough. But in that moment, let them kind of come up with some ways to start to figure it out. And as they get older, you'll need to teach them some of those ways. So,
any other tips? So we also do have some questions that we got from the Facebook page. And the first question is, my child is having issues with self-soothing and with also being demanding. I believe, this is Amy, and I believe that her child, I can't remember if it's boy or girl, but I believe it's around 2.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit younger than 2.
So a little bit younger than 2 and really having a hard time with self-soothing. And what I would say is that younger than 2, they're still going to need you a lot to soothe. that they don't really have the ability to take care of all those feelings on their own back, and that never for 1 second feel like if you can hold it too much, or love them too much, or give them too much touch and attention, because that's what they need. At that age, really, the only way that they feel safe and secure is to have constant connection. You are another adult that they feel safe with. So it may feel like you're spoiling him or doing too much for him or her. I don't know if it's a boy or girl. I'm not sure. But definitely lots of touch, lots of time in. What we find is that when kids really, really get those needs met, I mean, they really, really feel like somebody's really connected, really in tune, that they tend to need the soothing less. So it's almost like the more we hurry to make them independent, like the more they cling to us, right? Like they almost feel like we're pushing them out, and so they cling on tighter, right? So that would be the first part I would say about self-soothing. That it's okay. When I say that, I would also want to say that it's okay that if he cries in your crib, you don't have to be there 10 seconds before he starts crying. Like it's okay if he's upset for a few minutes and he has to sit with that upset for a few minutes. It's okay if you go to take a break and you leave him with the babysitter and he cries when you leave. Like you don't have to make sure his life is perfect all the time. That's not the goal. But that lots of love and attention right now in the world is what we really, really know now. It's not even a question of this is what I think, this is really brain development. It just makes it's like your being there teaches them how to soothe. So you really being there and helping them grow those things from their too, enables them to do it for themselves.
Right. It does, and some of that goes back to us taking care of ourselves, though, because when you're talking about, being there for them all the time, it gets a little, oh my goodness,
right.
It can be a little bit overwhelming, or I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed just when you're saying that.
It's an interesting statistic, and I don't have like the source like right on top of my head, so I hesitate to say it, but I know that a wonderful author named Bruce Perry, I was at a training, and I remember him saying something like, it used to be that we had 8 adults to 1 child. So in a village or a tribe or whatever, you would have, we used to, so that when there was a little tiny baby, there would be 8 adults. Now, and all those adults wouldn't have kids too, because that doesn't work, right? Like they would have maybe some older kids. Some of those other people might have been like older teenagers, but we have lots of other hands and people that child was connected with, and that is biologically how we're made to be. And instead, we reverse it, right? And we say, "Here, mom," or a stay-at-home dad. "Here we go. Why don't you stay home with 3 kids under the age of 5, all by yourself, and don't pull your hair out," right? It's a tall order. But I guess my other thing I would say about that as a mom, like a 23-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 17-year-old, is it just lasts forever. It's they say the days are long, but the years are short. It's true. It's like if you can give it this time now, you can sometimes keep yourself from having to do all the awful, terrible, hard stuff as adolescents. And I don't mean that all adolescents are awful and terrible, but it's just kind of like you're raising a calmer, more in tune, more connected child that's going to be less likely to make you get into some trouble for adolescents.
Because they'll be more connected with you, hopefully, and then you'll be able to have that relationship and communication.
And when we think about self-soothe, it's like we want to teach all people to self-soothe in healthy ways, right? And like we know the healthiest ways is when you have really good self-talk, right? So like you screw something up or make a mistake, and do you think you're a terrible, awful person, or do you go, "Oh, that was one part of me, and I messed it up, and now I get back on track"? That's self-talk, right? And the other part is to be able to reach out, because even the most mentally healthy person in the world is going to have times and moments when they're going to be overwhelmed. Like I can manage a lot, but if all of a sudden I got a phone call that one of my kids were hurt, I would need some help, right? I would need to call a friend and say, "This is too much. I need some help here," And so teaching, making it feel safe for them to reach out to others and to have some healthy ways to soothe themselves, keep something out of life and it's turning into everything. Because your emotions in your adolescence do become really intense. And you have these situations that are really intense for the first time you fall in love, or you get in with a group. And if you don't have ways to manage when those things aren't working out well, you do turn to other things that are destructive to self. And that's what we don't want. That's what we don't want. What's the other part of the question, Paige?
The next question was from Deborah, and it says, we are having some issues with her son, who's 2, breaking down when they leave him at daycare. It's only twice a week, but he cries and starts when we enter the parking lot. Okay. Any suggestions on that?
I think the most important thing that I say always is that make sure you're really comfortable with the daycare. That if you're like super sure that this is a good place and a good space for your child to be in, then that whole self-talk stuff again, like when they're having a fit, getting yourself in the right place, you have to have that in your head. You have to have that in your heart, because if you have any hesitation with who you're leaving them with, your child is going to know it. And they're going to know it even though they don't know that they know it. I mean, just think about that one, okay? That something inside their body is going to react and dump chemicals based on the fear that you're feeling inside of your body.
And that could not only be about the school, but maybe just your own kind of feelings about, oh gosh, I really don't want him to go, or
so part
maybe
of it
he doesn't like it, and then it kind of perpetuates from there.
Exactly. And so first thing, make sure you really feel confident. And granted, nobody's going to be as good as you at meeting the child. That's okay. That's part of how they learn how to deal with frustration and deal with the tough times in life that we all have, right? But is it safe? Is it safe? Is it, people there are pretty caring most of the time? Is it good? It can be a good experience for him or her. And project that to your child. Now, I'm not thinking for 1 second that your child's going to automatically not cry anymore, but that's the first step. That's the first step, is to make sure it's okay. And then as you said, Paige, it's really like you give yourself permission to be like, you know what? I know that it's not as good as care is. I'm not going to get as tuned into and one-on-one and perfection as he gets at home, but he's going to be fine there. And that's going to give me a chance to take care of myself, which is going to make me a better parent when I go to pick him up, and tomorrow and the next day. And so it's give yourself permission that he's not going to be miserable. Well, he's going to make it through it. I know it's not as perfect as it is at your house, but if it's for a few hours twice a week, I mean, he's got it pretty good, right?
Yeah. Okay, and then Beth had some questions about how to handle transitions with her son, who is 3 and a half. So, are there any thoughts on transitions? So it would be like waking up in the morning and kind of getting ready for the day, but then also waking up from naps. At school and that kind of thing. So those are some of the good ways to handle that.
I think it goes back to my example with Colin, and Colin taught me so much in this area. I mean, with the Legos, with waking up in the morning, because I'm the kind of person, I don't advise myself. I pretty much go with the flow, and I can change courses pretty quick. That's just me. It doesn't make me better than him. It's just who I am. And so when I had Dustin, he was the same way. And when I had Colin, he wasn't the same way. And it's as I've been married 24 years now. My husband's not that way. He needs some time to transition. He doesn't pop up first thing in the morning. So the best thing that I've learned for dealing with a child like that is to give them time. To understand that just because you can do it quickly doesn't mean that they can do it quickly. So a lot of times that means planning ahead, right? So our routine with Colin was he got up at 7, so we would go in at 6:50 and say, okay, Colin, you have 10 minutes till it's time to get up. And he would have to give us the rule was he had to give us some kind of verbal acknowledgement, or at least shake his head or something, so I know that he actually heard me, right? So I didn't go back in there at 7. He'd go, you never gave me my warning, which I can only tell you that from experience, right? Because he did it. But
that one time,
like, okay, I'm not doing that again. Or I did, and he claims I did. So like, okay, from now on, we'll do some kind of verbal acknowledgement here. But here's the thing, is that truthfully, even though I had to do it for Colin, it made me a better parent for all of my kids. Because isn't it just a respectful thing to do? I just think, can you imagine you're watching your favorite TV show, and somebody just comes up and changes the channel? We probably all had that happen to us too. But it's jarring, right? It's like, wait a minute, right? And it's kind of just like being a nice person, remembering that our children are people too, and that it's kind of just being polite and kind. And so give them some time, and also put a picture in their head of what the next situation is going to be, and what it's going to be like. And you can put your expectations in there too. Like we go back to the grocery store example. Okay, we're all going to go to the grocery store, and then we're at the grocery store, Sally's going to get to pick the cereal, and Joseph is going to get to pick the crackers this week, and then I'm going to need somebody to help me find some really good apples, And remember that if we don't hold on to the cart, then that means we have to sit in the buggy, or something like that. You set it all up ahead of time and try and make it fun, because having like the songs, fun, all that stuff just makes it better for everybody, Setting in the mind what you want to see, what you're expecting to see. And then guess what happens when we see it? Yay, right?
Love that behavior.
It really does reinforce this. So now it goes back to that prevention. The only way I can get your attention is to lay on the floor and kick my feet and scream. You can believe it. If I'm 3 or 4 or 5, that's what I'm going to do. Yeah.
Okay, and our last question is from Mandy, and it says, can 15-month-old babies have tantrums? And if so, what are some good strategies? We already talked about the strategies.
But I love this question, because what I love about this question is that it goes down to what we very first talked about in the beginning. And that a lot of us think about tantrums as being a form of manipulation. And I guess you could define it that way and say that when they're falling on the floor and screaming and crying and they're not trying to manipulate something, maybe it's not really a tantrum. But a 15-month-old is just not able yet to manipulate like that. So, can your 15-month-old be overwhelmed with emotions and fall apart? Absolutely. In fact, that's what they're supposed to do at 15 months old, because they don't have any other way to manage it, right? So if they're tired, if they're hungry, if they're itchy, if anything's wrong at all, they don't have any other way to deal with that feeling. So it just all comes out, all over the place. So it can feel like they're having temper tantrums. But I just want you to just remember, this is not manipulative. 15-month-olds cannot have that much forethought. They have incredible brains. It's incredible what they're learning and what they're taking in. They can't plan that far ahead by a long shot. 15-year-olds can probably plan that far ahead. Definitely not 15-month-olds.
Right. Thank you, Maureen.
Oh, thank you.
This has been wonderful.
It's been a lot of fun.
And please do follow us on Facebook or check out our website for all of our upcoming classes. We also have a parent coaching program to meet with either myself or Maureen. And we also do have parenting parties where we can come in and talk with your group of friends or family members about the topic of your choice, such as tantrums. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email or call. And thanks for attending.
Thank you.
Have a great day.